Guys, boxing gossip in the house. Hope everyone's doing well. It's Thursday evening. We're doing a special live one-off show because of some of the news that's gone on today in boxing. Got some spare time tonight, which is good. So wanted to come on and do a bit of a live stream. Shout out to David, shout out to Mikey, who's already in the chat. Good evening, guys. Before we get into it, let's start with a little bit of housekeeping. Podcast went up yesterday. I enjoyed yesterday's podcast. We had a good look back at Garcia Brona. We had a good look back at Jarrell Miller-Washington. We had a bit of a Anthony Yard Bullioni debate. And then we had a pretty entertaining, or at least I thought it was entertaining, Mayweather-McGregor fight. So that went up yesterday. You got best part of 2 hours of boxing chat up there. So if you haven't already, make sure you give that one a look. Video has just gone up probably about an hour or so ago with an early look ahead at George Groves versus Jamie Cox. You know, some discussion of that fight. So perhaps after this live stream, if you're interested, you can also check that out. But in this, we're going to start by talking about Wladimir Klitschko's retirement. We're then going to look ahead at Anthony Joshua's next move and how this potentially affects his career. I guess I'm going to want to burn here for 10 minutes or so. And then after we've done that, I'll go to the chat and hopefully we can get a bit of interaction. And if anyone wants to have their say, there'll be the opportunity to do that. But let's start by talking about Wladimir Klitschko. He's retired today. He's retired, a very, very wealthy man. He's retired with all his faculties intact. And he's retired in his early 40s, having been active in the sport of boxing for a hell of a long time. I have strong memories of Wladimir Klitschko. You know, I'm old enough to have been alive during the Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield era. If I'm honest, I wasn't old enough at the time, whilst I, enjoyed the fights, etc. I wasn't old enough at the time to fully appreciate that era whilst I was in it. And in my, I guess you could say, adult lifetime, Wladimir Klitschko, for me, has been the fighter who I have viewed as the most dominant fighter in the heavyweight division for the longest period of time. You know, when I started this YouTube channel, and when I was, really, really getting into boxing 6, 7, 8 years ago, and, really going from that casual fan to like an obsessed boxing fan, Wladimir Klitschko at the time, to me, as a young boxing fan, had an air of invincibility about him. You know, he was a guy who it was almost inconceivable that there was anyone else in the heavyweight division at the time who would beat him. And I believe his undefeated streak, his reign as a world champion, lasted for either 10 years or just short of 10 years, which, tells you all you need to know recently. Now, Wladimir Klitschko has a lot of detractors. He has people who still harp on about the fact he was stopped early on in his career. He has people who routinely tear apart his legacy based on the idea that he was an active champion in a very, very weak era. He has people, really, really cut into him for being boring, for being a jab and grab merchant, and really just kind of sort of downplaying the guy's achievements in the sport. My perspective on this is that boxing fans have warped memories, and whilst Wladimir Klitschko may not have been in the most competitive era of all time, perhaps some of that is due to Wladimir Klitschko himself, because the level that he was operating at was just so far in above of anyone else who was active in a time of the sport. Wladimir Klitschko's resume, when you look back at it, isn't bad at all. In fact, it's very, very, very good. You look back at some of the wins on his resume and the nature of those wins. Let's not forget, he went to Alexander Povetkin's backyard, and on my card, he won every single round of that fight. He fought David Haye when David Haye was at his peak and put on a complete domination on David Haye. He fought Wladimir Pulev, very highly regarded fighter at the time, and smashed him out of there in a few rounds. You know, Wladimir Klitschko, 10 years of dominance, all the belts, double Olympic gold medal, great career, great legacy. You know, there's a lot of sentiment again about boxing fans. Boxing fans very much look back at fighters from the olden days and try and make out that they're somehow impossibly good fighters who no one of this age could ever be. You know, you'll hear people waxing lyrical about Jack Dempsey and Rocky Marciano and all of those fighters. And I'm sure they were great fighters, but, you know, you look at them and you see a few grainy clips on YouTube that don't really tell you much of a story. And, you know, people will say that, like, it's inconceivable you can rate Wladimir Klitschko amongst great names like that. Well, perhaps that's a debate we can get into on another day. What I will say is, for me, Wladimir Klitschko, a definite first ballot Hall of Famer. Wladimir Klitschko, definitely in the conversation for the top 15 heavyweights of all time. You know, you could disagree with that. You could suggest that his name doesn't deserve to be in that mix. But my suggestion is that if you are having that conversation about drawing up a list of the top 15 or 20 heavyweights of all time, it would be remiss of you not to consider Wladimir Klitschko. The wins on his resume, the longevity, the dominance over a period of time. You know, the fact that he lost on his way up as a young fighter, the fact that he maybe wasn't active in an era where there was a Foreman or a Fraser like Ali had, or where there was a Tyson or a Holyfield like Lewis had. You can only beat who's put in front of you. This is a man who took on all comers. This was a guy still looking to take fights against the likes of Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, even in his 40s. And, you know, for my money, you know, I've said you'd be remiss not to have him in the conversation for top 15, top 20. For my money, I actually have him slightly higher than that. You know, I think Wladimir Klitschko, for me, deserves to be in the top 10. You know, when I look at Wladimir Klitschko, I think of a man who has truly mastered his style. You know, a complete athlete. For my money, one of the best jabs of all time that I've witnessed. A huge power puncher. And a guy, you know, when Wladimir was at his absolute best, he was an underrated defensive fighter. You know, he had mastered that style so much. He'd mastered his judgment of range. He'd mastered his ability to close down other opponents. You know, he's got very, very good footwork and athleticism for such a good guy. Real underrated technician, Wladimir Klitschko. I really think he would have been a very, very hard man to beat at his peak. And I rate him very, very highly. Of course, wish him all the best in his retirement. He's got a great family. He's got a huge amount of money in the bank. He's got a brother who's you know, heavily involved in politics. I'm sure the opportunities and possibilities for Wladimir Klitschko are endless, and you know, it's good to see that he didn't carry on for far too long. You know, you look at those great heavyweights. You look at Muhammad Ali going on and fighting, I think it was Larry Holmes, who he fought at the end of his career. You look at Larry Holmes going on and fighting at the end of his career. You look at Mike Tyson getting, you know, beaten up by Danny Williams at the end of his career. You know, you look at all of those guys, and you look at guys who carry on for too long in the sport. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, history may look back in 10 years and say Wladimir Klitschko carried on too long. He shouldn't have fought Fury. He shouldn't have fought Joshua. And that may be the case. But with his faculties intact, and I don't think he needed to carry on for too much longer. So I'm pleased that he's made the decision, and I'll always remember Wladimir very, very favourably. Big Wladimir Klitschko fan. Enough respect for him coming from my end, certainly. Where does that leave us? Well, the Joshua Klitschko rematch clearly isn't going to happen. Now, commercially, that is a big wasted opportunity. Clearly, the money in the rematch would have been astronomical. But neither of these guys, Wladimir or Joshua, presumably need the money. Both of them have already earned ridiculous amounts of money in their career. Joshua has astronomical earning potential going forward. I, for one, I would have watched the rematch. I would have buzzed off the rematch. Don't get me wrong. It was a great first fight. They're two of the very, very top heavyweights in the world. I, for one, am not distraught that the rematch isn't going to happen. You know, I think we saw what we need to see in the first fight. Wladimir Klitschko is only going to get older. Anthony Joshua, in my opinion, is only going to get better. And I kind of think Joshua did what he needed to do to prove himself in that first fight. And I think Joshua would probably do an even better job going into the rematch against Wladimir Klitschko, in my perspective. So whilst it would have been a good fight, and whilst I'm sure we'd have all enjoyed it, I'm not really depressed that it isn't happening. You know, I'm quite happy to keep some momentum in the sport and for Anthony Joshua to move on to something new, to the next chapter, and take on a new challenge. What does that challenge look like? Well, for my money, most likely it's going to be Wladimir Pulev. He is Joshua's mandatory, and I've heard Eddie Hearn say on several interviews that if the Wladimir Klitschko fight doesn't happen, they have to fight Wladimir Pulev. And I believe Joshua would probably be stripped of his world title, certainly the IBF person, if he didn't. So I suspect that fight will happen next. Now, Wladimir Pulev, he, for me, has been a top 10 fighter for some time now, you know, consistently operating in that between number 5 and number 10 position. He's a very, very good fighter, accomplished amateur, accomplished technician, very, very good jabber. But he's not one of these fighters. He's one of these fighters who's a consistent top 10 fighter, but he's probably not one of these guys who's ever going to be an elite fighter. I've always described him, and long-time viewers will know this, but I've described him on multiple occasions on this channel as a poor man's Wladimir Klitschko. Stylistically, he is very similar to Wladimir Klitschko. Technician, outside boxer, very reliant on the jab, looks to close you down and hold on the inside. Really a guy who needs to use distance, use range, and establish his jab to get his game up and running. That's always been my perspective on Wladimir Pulev. He's a lot smaller than Wladimir Klitschko. His punching power is a hell of a lot lighter than Wladimir Klitschko. And I believe potentially he is someone who could fold a hell of a lot easier than Wladimir Klitschko. And if you look back at that fight where Pulev fought Wladimir Klitschko a few years ago, Klitschko was absolutely able to dominate him. Klitschko, in a right way, was able to completely steamroller him and almost run him over. Pulev had one or two moments, but really Klitschko had him hurt from the beginning of the fight and was able to get an early stoppage as a result. As for Wladimir Pulev versus Anthony Joshua, Wladimir Pulev is the kind of guy who stylistically can cause certain fighters problems. You know, you look at someone like a Jarrell Miller. Wladimir Pulev could cause Jarrell Miller a hell of a lot of problems if he was able to dance around Miller and keep him at range and pick him apart with the jab and score points against him. I don't see Wladimir Pulev having the levels to his game to deal with an Anthony Joshua. Joshua at this point represents the cream of the cream. He represents an elite boxer. And I do just think that he is going to be able to walk through Wladimir Pulev. I suspect that Wladimir Pulev will have very minimal success at keeping range and using his jab and, you know, tagging Joshua from the outside with his jab. And I suspect Joshua will be able to get into that mid-range that he so enjoys against Wladimir Pulev. I suspect he will make Pulev look very, very small in comparison to him. And I just don't think that Pulev will have the size or the punching power or the athleticism, really, to keep Joshua at bay. Once Joshua was able to implement his game plan, once Joshua was able to start putting punches together, I do suspect that Wladimir Pulev will fold relatively tamely. He's fought non-punchers, really. If you look at his best wins, Tony Thompson, Derek Chisora, Ustinov, you know, none of these guys are thunderous punchers. The time he stepped up against a big puncher in Vlad, he was all over the place and hurt near instantaneously in that fight. I don't think Wladimir Pulev really has the fortitude, the strength, the style to deal with a guy like Anthony Joshua, who is coming into the fight with so much momentum. There is no better preparation to beat Wladimir Pulev than to beat Wladimir Klitschko. Wladimir Klitschko poses a lot of the same problems that Pulev does, but he poses more problems, and he poses the same problems to a much higher degree. So I can't see anything other than a Joshua win in this fight. I suspect it will be a Joshua win by knockout. And even though Pulev's a better fighter than a Dominic Breazeale, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if the fight ends earlier than that, because whether Pulev has, you know, got the chin, got the durability, got the desire, I don't know. And I suspect it's easy work for Anthony Joshua. So that's my thoughts in a nutshell. Probably been ranting now for 10, 15 minutes. But yeah, huge news that Wladimir Klitschko retires, and Joshua versus Pulev to come next. Let's go into the chat. If you want your comment in the chat to be read out, I'm not going to go back for the previous comments, but put hashtag BG, and as long as it's relevant to the conversation we're having, I will read it out. Jet's in the chat. Shout out to Jet. Good man says, how many times does AJ fight this year? I suspect just the once more. I think end of the year, November, December, most likely. And I've heard Hearn say he's going to be fighting twice a year from now on. Scunny Tom says, going to need to be a stronger undercard. Pulev is a big step down, especially for the casual market. I agree. Pulev is a big step down, although I would say that Joshua's name and brand is at an all-time high following on from that Wladimir Klitschko fight. So Joshua himself may be a bigger draw. Simon says, AJ versus Wilder, who wins? It's a pick and fight that, but I'll give it to AJ by a whisker at the minute. Tanvir says, best wins for Vlad. Well, I think for me, that period when he was taking out David Haye and Povetkin, you know, the dominance in those wins for me, I mean, those are probably his best two wins, as I think. Yeah, so there we go, guys. Not too much coming through in the chat. This isn't expected to be a long live stream, so I think I will probably wrap it up there because I've got other stuff to do this evening. But thanks to everyone, as always, for joining. Thanks to everyone who's been commenting in the chat. Thanks to everyone who's watched live. And yeah, if you are one of those, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're new, please do subscribe to the channel, and we'll be back very, very soon. So cheers, guys. Have a good evening, and speak to you soon. Bye now.